She was a wild, tiny alien no one could tame. Then she started acting like a pet to one human. Jack Mitchell had never imagined that his crash landing on an unknown planet would lead to anything extraordinary. It was meant to be a simple journey, a stopover on his way to another galaxy, but a technical malfunction turned his routine trip into a disaster. The ship's engines failed in the middle of space, and Jack barely managed to guide it to a planet that looked uninhabited. As he limped his way through the dense atmosphere, he couldn't help but wonder if this would be the end of his spacefaring days. His ship, a small freighter, wasn't designed for emergencies like this. Still, he'd managed to land it in one piece. For now, that was enough. Jack's only hope was that he could fix it, or at the very least, figure out a way to survive long enough to be rescued. He was resourceful, having spent years traveling the galaxy, and he wasn't about to let one unlucky incident keep him from living. So with his tools in hand and a mind focused on survival, he set out to explore the unknown terrain. The planet, as he soon discovered, was lush and green. Towering trees with enormous leaves stretched toward the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The air smelled fresh and clean, and a distant river could be heard flowing steadily. But Jack wasn't interested in the beauty of the planet. He needed to focus on his ship. The first few days were spent trying to gather supplies and map the area. There were no signs of civilization, no signals or transmissions, just the quiet hum of the wild. Jack set up a makeshift camp near the wreckage of his ship, using his equipment to perform basic repairs. However, the more he worked, the more he realized that it wasn't just his ship that was broken. This place, this planet, was unfamiliar in every sense. He could feel it in the air, in the way the trees moved, in the strange calls of unseen creatures. There was something about this place that felt off, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Then, one day, as Jack was scavenging the nearby forest for parts to help repair his ship, he heard a rustling in the bushes. The sound was quick, sharp, like someone was moving through the underbrush. Jack paused and looked around, his hand instinctively reaching for the blaster at his side. The last thing he needed was to encounter some wild animal. The rustling grew louder, and then, out of nowhere, a tiny creature emerged from the trees. At first, Jack thought it was some kind of wild animal. It was small, about the size of a child, with glowing green skin and large, curious eyes that seemed to flicker with intelligence. It had sharp, almost predatory features, with long claws and a slender, agile body. But what caught Jack's attention wasn't just its appearance, it was the way it moved. The creature was quick, graceful, and appeared to be assessing Jack just as much as he was assessing it. Jack took a slow step back, wary but intrigued. The creature's eyes narrowed as it tilted its head, and for a moment there was an eerie silence. Neither of them moved. Then, as though it had made a decision, the alien girl let out a low growl and darted toward him, her claws flashing dangerously in the sunlight. Jack's instincts kicked in, and he drew his blaster, ready to defend himself. But before he could fire, the creature stopped abruptly, her head tilting once again as she studied him closely. "Easy there," Jack muttered to himself, lowering his weapon slightly. "I'm not your enemy." The creature let out a series of high-pitched clicks, then crouched in front of him, her eyes still locked on his. There was something almost curious in her gaze. Jack's mind raced as he tried to figure out what was going on. He had read about alien species before, but nothing like this. She wasn't a typical wild animal. There was something more to her, a depth that Jack couldn't quite understand. For the next few hours, Jack kept his distance, watching the alien girl as she circled around him, darting in and out of the shadows like a small predator. But she didn't attack. Instead, she seemed to be sizing him up, as though trying to decide whether or not he was a threat. Over the next few days, the creature, whom Jack had come to call Siri, continued to appear. She never got too close, but she was always there, watching from the shadows. She would occasionally scavenge food from his camp, though she never made any effort to take it directly from him. Jack noticed that she wasn't just wild, there was a sort of intelligence behind her actions. She wasn't attacking or acting purely out of instinct. There was some deeper reasoning behind her movements. And yet, despite this, she remained unpredictable. One moment, she would be staring at him with wide, curious eyes, and the next, she would vanish into the underbrush, leaving Jack to wonder if he had imagined the whole thing. A few more days passed, and Jack had nearly given up hope of ever being rescued. The isolation was starting to wear on him. But one evening, as he was sitting by the fire, trying to think of a plan to repair his ship, he heard the soft sound of footsteps behind him. He turned, expecting to see Siri again, but instead, a small rock was thrown toward him. It hit the ground beside his foot, and Jack looked up to see the alien girl standing just beyond the edge of the firelight. Her glowing green eyes were fixed on him, and this time she wasn't circling. She was standing still, watching him with what seemed like amusement. Jack raised an eyebrow. "You want something?" Siri didn't answer with words, of course. Instead, she took a step closer and sat down a few feet away from him, watching him with a steady gaze. Jack couldn't help but chuckle at the situation. Here he was, stuck on a planet with a tiny, wild alien who couldn't be tamed, and yet she was acting more like a curious pet than a threat. "All right then," Jack said, half to himself, half to her. "You can hang around, but I'm not feeding you every time you show up. You're gonna have to work for your food." Siri blinked at him, her large eyes narrowing in what could only be described as confusion. She tilted her head, obviously trying to figure out if he was joking or not. Jack couldn't help but laugh again. The wild little alien was a mystery, one that seemed to grow more complicated the longer she stayed around. From that night on, their strange, silent companionship began. Jack would work on his ship during the day, and Siri would watch from a distance, occasionally getting close enough to inspect his tools or scavenge food. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for Jack, who had been utterly alone on this strange world, it was a welcome change. As the days passed, Jack realized that Siri was becoming a constant presence in his life. She was no longer just an unpredictable wild creature. She had become something else. Something more, and while Jack couldn't yet understand the full extent of their connection, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone anymore. The days began to blur together as Jack worked tirelessly to fix his ship. The crash had left him with limited supplies, but he used everything he had to make small repairs, hoping he could get the engines running again. His hands were stained with grease, and his muscles ached from hours of labor, but there was something in the air that kept him going. Maybe it was the thought of getting off this strange planet, or maybe it was the strange companionship that had started to develop with the tiny alien girl who now followed him everywhere. Siri, as Jack had come to call her, was no longer just a wild creature. She had become something more, a presence, always lurking just out of reach, watching his every move. Jack wasn't sure when it had happened, but one day he realized she had started to trust him. At first, she was just an observer, darting in and out of the shadows, watching him from a distance. But over time, she had started to get closer, inching her way into his camp, curiously investigating his tools and equipment. It was almost as though she was learning from him, picking up on his actions. Jack didn't mind. In fact, he had grown used to her quiet presence. There was something strangely comforting about having her around. She never caused trouble anymore. She didn't steal his food or attack him when he wasn't looking. Instead, she seemed content to sit nearby, watching him work on his ship, her glowing eyes following every movement. One morning, as Jack worked on the ship's wiring, he heard a soft rustling behind him. He turned, expecting to see Siri sneaking up on him again, but this time she wasn't alone. She had brought something with her, a small, broken tool, the kind Jack had left lying around. Siri was holding it in her tiny hands, and she was staring at it with great curiosity. Jack smiled to himself, feeling a strange warmth spread through him. The alien girl was learning, slowly but surely. She had noticed the tool, and now she was trying to figure out how it worked. Jack stood up and walked over to her, crouching down to her level. She didn't flinch or run away, as she would have done in the past. Instead, she looked up at him with those wide, glowing eyes, almost as if she was waiting for him to do something. "Need some help?" Jack asked, his voice gentle. Siri tilted her head the way she always did when something confused her. She held out the broken tool to Jack, as if offering it to him. Jack took it from her hands, inspecting it for a moment before looking back at her. "I think this is something I can fix. You want to learn how?" Siri's eyes flickered with something that almost looked like excitement. She nodded, then sat back on her haunches, watching intently as Jack began to work on the tool. For the next few hours, Jack showed her how to use the tools he had, explaining each step as he fixed the small device. Siri listened closely, her attention never wavering. Every now and then, she would mimic his movements, picking up small objects and holding them as though she were trying to copy his actions. By the time the tool was fixed, Jack had a strange sense of pride. It wasn't just that he had repaired something, it was that Siri had shown a genuine interest in learning. She wasn't just a wild alien anymore, she was becoming something else, something more. She was becoming human in a way. At least that was how it felt to Jack. Over the next few days, their routine settled into something comfortable. Jack would work on the ship during the day, and Siri would follow him around, observing his every move. She was always nearby, never far from him. Sometimes she would sit in the shade, watching quietly, and other times she would get close, trying to help in her own way. There were still moments of wildness, of course. Siri would sometimes dart off into the forest, chasing after some invisible prey or making strange, high-pitched sounds that Jack didn't understand. But she always returned, just as curious and just as eager to learn as before. It was during one of these quiet moments that Jack realized something. He had grown used to Siri's presence, and somewhere along the way, she had stopped being a threat. She was no longer the wild creature that had first appeared on the planet, claws flashing and teeth bared. She had become something else, something almost familiar. That evening, as the sun began to set and the sky turned a brilliant shade of purple, Jack sat by the fire, staring into the flames. His ship was still far from being repaired, but it was coming along. He was starting to feel a sense of hope, a flicker of possibility. The worst of the isolation was over, and while he still had no idea when or if he would be rescued, at least he had Siri. She was company in a way that no one else could be. They hadn't spoken a word to each other, but that didn't seem to matter. Siri was sitting across the fire from him, her large eyes reflecting the flickering flames. She was crouched low, her tail twitching with an odd kind of energy. For the first time, Jack noticed that she was waiting for something, though he wasn't sure what. "Do you ever just sit still?" Jack asked, half to himself. He chuckled under his breath, realizing how strange it sounded. But Siri seemed to understand, or at least she recognized the question for what it was. She looked at him, then turned her attention back to the fire, her eyes narrowing slightly. It was as though she was processing the question, thinking it over. Jack sighed, leaning back against the tree behind him. He didn't expect an answer, of course, but there was something comforting about their silence. Over time, the two of them had developed an unspoken bond, something that didn't need words to be understood. Siri had never been tamed. She was still wild, still untamed in her own way, but she had come to trust him, and that in itself was something remarkable. As the evening wore on, Jack couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would they stay here forever, on this lonely planet, living in quiet companionship? Would Jack ever be able to repair his ship and leave? Or would Siri's behavior continue to change, becoming something even more unexpected than it already had? He didn't have the answers, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone. There was something in the air, something between them, that made the silence feel less empty. It was as though, in some strange way, they had become family. He didn't know what the future held, but with Siri by his side, he felt ready to face whatever came next. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky above, Jack settled down to sleep, his thoughts filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Siri, as always, was close by, curled up in a spot near the fire. She was watching him, her glowing eyes gleaming in the darkness. And Jack, despite the uncertainty of his situation, couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, everything was going to be all right. Days passed, and the routine between Jack and Siri grew more settled. The sun rose, casting a warm, golden light over the forest, and Jack worked on the ship while Siri followed him around, observing his every move. It was as though they had fallen into a quiet rhythm, one where words were no longer necessary. They didn't need to speak to understand each other. There was a silent connection between them now, something that had started with curiosity and had slowly transformed into something deeper. Jack had always been a loner, used to spending long stretches of time alone. But in all his years traveling the galaxy, he had never imagined that his closest companion would be a wild alien girl. Yet here they were. Siri was no longer just a creature of instinct. She was becoming something more. It was subtle at first, just small changes, but Jack could feel it. She was learning, adapting, changing. One morning, as Jack worked on the ship, he noticed that Siri wasn't watching him from her usual spot. She wasn't sitting in the shade or lurking in the trees. He looked around, scanning the area for her, but she was nowhere to be found. He felt a brief pang of worry, but then he heard a noise behind him. He turned, and there she was, standing just a few feet away. But this time she wasn't sneaking up on him or waiting for him to notice her. She was looking at him, her eyes locked on his, and she held something in her hands. Siri had found a small rock, shaped roughly like a hammer. It wasn't much, but she had clearly been searching for it, as though she knew it had a purpose. She stepped closer to Jack, holding the rock out to him with a look that was almost hopeful. Jack blinked in surprise, then smiled. "Are you trying to help me?" Siri didn't answer, but the way she looked at him said it all. There was no aggression in her eyes anymore, no wild, unpredictable energy. She was offering him the rock, and in her own way, she was asking to be part of what he was doing. Jack crouched down to her level, taking the rock from her gently. "I think we can work with this," he said, almost to himself. He showed her how to use the rock to help break down some larger materials he had been collecting, and slowly she began to understand. Each time he demonstrated a task, Siri would watch carefully, then try it herself. She wasn't as fast as Jack, but she was learning. Her movements were becoming more deliberate, more controlled. She wasn't just imitating him now, she was thinking, figuring things out on her own. As the days turned into weeks, Siri's behavior continued to change. She was no longer just an observer. She had become an active participant in their daily routine. She would help Jack gather materials for the ship, picking up tools with surprising dexterity and even setting small tasks for herself. The wild, unpredictable energy that had defined her earlier was still there, but now it was balanced with something else. There was a calmness about her, a quiet focus that Jack hadn't seen before. One afternoon, Jack was working on the ship's engine, trying to figure out why it wasn't starting. It was a delicate task, one that required precision and care. Siri, as always, was sitting nearby, watching him intently. But today, she wasn't just watching. She was mimicking his movements, sitting cross-legged and moving her hands in small, careful motions, as though she, too, was working on something important. Jack couldn't help but smile at the sight. She was trying to learn, trying to help in her own way. "Siri," he said, glancing over at her, "you're doing it all wrong." He chuckled under his breath, "But at least you're trying." She tilted her head at him, a spark of recognition in her eyes. It was as if she understood that he was teasing her. She didn't respond, of course, but her eyes twinkled with what could only be described as amusement. Jack shook his head and went back to his work, but for the first time he felt a sense of pride. She wasn't just a wild creature anymore. She was growing, changing, becoming something more than he could have ever expected. That night, as they sat by the fire, Jack couldn't help but think about how far they had come. Siri had changed so much in such a short amount of time. She was still wild in her own way, still unpredictable, still capable of causing trouble. But now she was also capable of learning, of adapting. She had become something more than just an alien species to be feared. She had become familiar. As the fire crackled, Jack looked over at Siri, who was curled up in her usual spot, her tail flicking occasionally. She had become a part of his life in a way he never thought possible. She wasn't just a creature he had to deal with anymore. She was his companion, his friend. He wasn't sure when it had happened, but somewhere along the way, she had stopped being an enigma and had started to feel like family. "Siri," Jack said softly, "you're not so bad, you know that?" Siri didn't respond, of course, she never did. But she looked up at him with those wide, glowing eyes, and Jack could see the understanding there. It wasn't just that she had changed. He had changed, too. He had come to accept her, to appreciate her in a way that he never thought he could. She wasn't just a wild alien girl anymore. She was a part of his life, a part of his journey. As the night grew colder, Jack leaned back against the tree and closed his eyes, listening to the soft sounds of the forest around him. For the first time since he had crash-landed on this planet, he felt at peace. Siri's presence, once a constant reminder of his isolation, now felt comforting. She wasn't just a creature to be feared. She was a companion, someone who had become an integral part of his life in a way that he could no longer ignore. The days continued to pass, and the bond between Jack and Siri only deepened. They spent hours together, working on the ship, exploring the forest, or simply sitting in silence. Siri had become so much more than Jack could have imagined. Her wildness was still there, but now it was tempered by a deep curiosity, a desire to learn, to understand. And as Jack worked on his ship, trying to fix the final pieces, he realized that Siri wasn't just helping him with the ship anymore. She was helping him with his loneliness. She had become the one constant in his life, the one thing he could rely on. Even though he had never expected it, even though he had never wanted it, Jack had found something in Siri, a bond that was as unexpected as it was strong. One day, as Jack was tightening the last bolt on the engine, Siri came over to him, holding something small in her hands. It was a broken piece of metal, a part of the ship that had fallen off during the crash. Jack took it from her, inspecting it. "We don't need this part," he said, but he smiled at her. "But thanks for bringing it." Siri stared at him for a moment, then tilted her head as if trying to understand what he meant. Jack chuckled softly. "You're always trying to help," he said. "You're a good one, Siri." Siri let out a soft, almost satisfied sound, as though she understood that Jack was giving her praise. She stepped back, sitting down on the ground next to him, her eyes watching him intently as he worked. She wasn't just a wild alien anymore. She was something more, something that Jack never expected, but something he had come to appreciate. And as Jack finished his work on the ship, he realized that the repairs were only part of the journey. The real change had happened between him and Siri. They had both grown, both changed in ways they couldn't have predicted. And though Jack still didn't know what the future held, he knew one thing for sure. With Siri by his side, anything was possible. The days had become peaceful, a steady rhythm that Jack had come to rely on. He would wake up early in the morning, greet the day with a quiet optimism, and get to work on his ship. Siri, as always, was by his side, observing him with those curious, glowing eyes. There were no more wild outbursts or sudden attacks. The alien girl had become his quiet companion, learning from him and helping when she could. Jack had repaired much of the ship, and though it wasn't yet ready to fly, he could feel that progress was being made. It had been weeks since Jack had crash-landed on the planet, and while there was still no sign of rescue, Jack had stopped worrying. The planet was beautiful, the forest vast and full of strange wildlife, but Jack had found a new kind of comfort in his isolation. Siri had become more than just a creature he had to survive with. She had become a part of his life. But Jack knew that his situation wasn't permanent. His ship wasn't built for long-term survival on an unknown planet. Eventually, he would need to leave. The thought of being stranded forever was something he pushed to the back of his mind, but it was always there, lurking. One evening, as Jack was working on the ship, he heard a strange sound. It wasn't the usual rustling of leaves or the calls of animals in the forest. It was something different, something that didn't belong. Jack's hands stilled on the tool he was using, and his eyes darted to the trees surrounding him. Siri, who had been nearby, immediately tensed, her ears flicking as she too sensed the change in the air. The sound grew louder, a low hum that seemed to reverberate through the ground. Jack's heart began to race. He had spent enough time on the planet to know that this wasn't a natural sound. It wasn't the wind or a creature, it was something else. Suddenly, from the shadows of the trees, a figure appeared. It was a human, a soldier, dressed in dark armor with a helmet that obscured his face. Behind him, a group of armed figures emerged, all wearing the same uniform. They moved with purpose, scanning the area as they approached Jack's camp. Siri growled low in her throat, her body tensing as she watched the newcomers. Jack stood up slowly, trying to keep calm. His heart was racing, but he kept his voice steady. "Who are you?" Jack called out, his voice echoing through the stillness of the forest. The soldier in the front didn't answer immediately. Instead, he raised his hand, signaling for his group to halt. His eyes, hidden behind the helmet, seemed to scan the area, settling on Jack. "We've come for the alien," the soldier said, his voice cold and emotionless. Jack's stomach dropped. Alien, he knew exactly who they meant. Siri. The thought sent a chill through him. These soldiers weren't here by accident. They had come for her. "Why?" Jack asked, his voice tight. "She's not a threat to anyone." The soldier tilted his head slightly, though his face remained hidden behind the helmet. "That's not for you to decide," he said. "The Galactic Council has ordered her retrieval. She's a danger and she's to be brought back to the authorities." Jack's mind raced. The Galactic Council. He had heard of them, a governing body that controlled much of the galaxy, making decisions that affected millions of lives. But Siri was just a wild alien girl. She hadn't done anything wrong, nothing that would warrant being taken away like this. "You can't take her," Jack said firmly, stepping in front of Siri protectively. "She's not your property." The soldier didn't seem to care about Jack's words. Without warning, he stepped forward, his hand reaching out to grab Jack by the arm. But before he could make contact, Siri sprang into action. With a speed that surprised Jack, Siri lunged at the soldier, her claws flashing in the fading light. The soldier tried to block her attack, but Siri was too quick. She slashed at his arm, causing him to stumble back in pain. The other soldiers immediately raised their weapons, pointing them at her, but Jack stepped forward, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. "Stop," Jack shouted. "She's not attacking you, she's protecting herself." The soldiers hesitated, clearly confused by the situation. They had expected a dangerous alien, one who would fight back, but what they were seeing didn't fit their expectations. Siri was standing her ground, her eyes focused on the soldiers, but she wasn't attacking them further. She was only defending herself, and Jack knew that if they gave her a chance, she wouldn't strike again. "I said stop," Jack repeated, his voice firm. The leader of the soldiers lowered his weapon slightly, though his stance remained tense. "You're making a mistake," he said. "This alien is a threat. She's dangerous, and you're standing in the way of the Council's orders." Jack shook his head. "She's not a threat. She's just a wild creature trying to survive, just like me, just like you." There was a long pause. The soldiers were still, their weapons trained on Siri, but the leader seemed to be considering Jack's words. Siri, sensing the tension, took a step back, though she didn't lower her guard. Jack could feel the air between them crackling with tension. "You can't take her," Jack repeated, his voice quieter now. "She's been through enough, you don't know what you're dealing with." The soldier seemed to weigh Jack's words carefully, then looked at the others in his group. They exchanged a few brief glances, and finally the leader nodded. "We'll take her by force if we have to," he said coldly, his hand tightening around the handle of his weapon. "But if you resist, we'll have no choice but to neutralize you." Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know what to do. He was outnumbered, and even if he fought back, he knew the odds were stacked against him. Siri, for all her strength, was no match for a group of trained soldiers. But Jack wasn't going to give up without a fight. He wasn't about to let them take her away, not after everything they had been through together. He looked at Siri, his eyes meeting hers. There was something in that moment, a silent understanding. She was ready to fight to protect him, but Jack knew that wasn't the solution. They couldn't win this battle by force. "We don't want trouble," Jack said slowly, his voice calm but firm. "Just leave. Go back to your council and tell them that Siri doesn't belong to anyone." For a long moment, the soldier didn't move. The tension hung thick in the air. Then, without warning, the leader raised his weapon again and aimed it at Jack. "Step aside," the soldier ordered. "We don't have time for your words. Move." Jack's pulse quickened, but he stood his ground. Siri stepped closer to him, her body tensed, ready to defend him if the need arose. "We'll never let you take her," Jack said, his voice resolute. "Not while I'm here." The soldiers exchanged a brief glance, clearly uncertain of how to proceed. Jack knew this was their last chance. If they didn't back off now, things would only get worse. The leader of the soldiers hesitated, his eyes flicking between Jack and Siri. There was something almost begrudging in his gaze, as if he was torn between following orders and recognizing the bond between Jack and the alien girl. "Last warning," the soldier growled. "Step aside." But Jack didn't move. And as he looked into the soldier's eyes, he realized one thing: he wasn't going to let anyone take her. Not without a fight. The leader of the soldiers stood tall, his weapon aimed squarely at Jack. The rest of the group had formed a tight circle around him and Siri, their eyes watching closely. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jack stood firm, his feet planted on the ground, his chest rising and falling with each breath, but he wasn't backing down. Not now, not when it mattered the most. "Move aside," the soldier repeated, his voice hard as stone, but Jack didn't flinch. Siri, standing close beside Jack, was a force of nature. Her small body tensed, her glowing eyes fixed on the soldiers, watching them with a predator's focus. She didn't trust them. Jack could see that in the way she held herself, her muscles coiled, ready for action. But Jack wasn't sure if fighting was the right answer. He wasn't sure if they could win, not against trained soldiers with advanced weapons. And yet he couldn't just let them take her. Not after everything they had been through. Not after Siri had trusted him, learned from him, become part of his life. He couldn't let them tear that apart. "I'm not moving," Jack said, his voice calm but filled with resolve. He stood his ground, his eyes meeting the soldiers, trying to show that he wasn't afraid. He was scared, of course, terrified even, but he wasn't going to let it show, not now. The leader of the soldiers seemed to hesitate for a moment, his eyes narrowing. The standoff between them felt like it had lasted hours, though in reality it had been mere seconds. Everything was at a boiling point, and Jack knew that any wrong move could end this in a way he wasn't prepared for. "We don't want to hurt you," the soldier said after a moment, though his tone was cold, almost dismissive. "But we will. If you resist, we'll take her by force." Jack's hand tightened into a fist. He had been in tough situations before, but this was different. These soldiers weren't just some random threat. They were following orders from a powerful organization, the Galactic Council, one of the most influential forces in the galaxy. If they took Siri, she would be gone forever. Jack didn't know what would happen to her, but he couldn't allow it to happen, not without a fight. "You don't get it," Jack said, his voice low but fierce. "She's not a weapon and she's not a prisoner. She's a living being, just like you, just like me. She deserves to be free." Siri, standing next to him, let out a low growl, the kind of sound that made the soldiers pause for a moment. She wasn't just angry. She was protecting something that mattered to her. Jack could feel the intensity of the moment. It was more than just an alien fight. It was about everything they had built together. The bond between them, the trust that had formed over weeks of working together, of surviving together. That was something the soldiers didn't understand. They saw a creature to be controlled, to be captured, to be put in a cage. They didn't see a companion, a friend. The leader of the soldiers didn't flinch, but Jack could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He wasn't used to being challenged, not like this. He had probably dealt with resistance before, but this was different. Jack wasn't some helpless civilian. He wasn't just going to hand over Siri without a fight. "I said move aside," the soldier repeated, this time with more force in his voice. He took a step closer, his weapon still aimed at Jack. "You don't understand what you're doing. The council has already decided. This is bigger than you." Jack didn't move an inch. He could feel the sweat trickling down his back, the tension building in his chest. He knew this wasn't just a conversation anymore. This was the moment where everything changed. He could give in. He could let them take Siri, and they could both go back to their lives, trying to forget the connection they'd made. Or he could stand his ground. He could fight for her, fight for what they had built together. He could fight for freedom. "Let them take her," a voice suddenly called out from the edge of the clearing. Jack turned, his heart skipping a beat. Another figure had appeared, standing at the edge of the forest. This person wasn't wearing a uniform, wasn't carrying a weapon. They were just a figure in the distance, silhouetted by the last light of the setting sun. The soldiers turned as well, and for a moment there was confusion in their eyes. The figure stepped forward, and Jack's heart froze as he recognized them. It was another human. A woman, tall and strong-looking, her eyes sharp and calculating. She was walking with purpose, her gaze never leaving the soldiers. But what caught Jack's attention wasn't just her appearance. It was the fact that she wasn't scared. She wasn't afraid of the soldiers. She was standing tall, unbothered by their weapons, their threats. She was like Jack in that sense, determined to protect. "Who are you?" the soldier leader demanded, his voice rising in alarm. "This doesn't concern you." The woman didn't flinch. She looked at the soldiers with a cool, almost dismissive gaze. "It does now," she said simply, her voice strong and confident. "I'm here to stop you from making a mistake." Jack watched as the woman moved toward the soldiers, her eyes scanning each one of them. The soldiers seemed to hesitate, unsure of how to handle this new situation. The leader looked from the woman to Jack, then back again, clearly uncertain about what to do next. "I don't care who you are," the soldier leader said, his grip tightening on his weapon. "This alien is under the council's jurisdiction. You can't interfere." The woman didn't back down. "The council has no authority here," she said, her voice cold. "Not anymore." For a moment there was only silence. Jack could feel the weight of the moment, the tension hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. The soldiers seemed to be waiting for something, and Jack wasn't sure what it was. But in that instant, everything seemed to change. The woman moved with a fluidity that Jack could only describe as practiced. Before the soldiers could react, she reached into her jacket and pulled out a small device. With a flick of her wrist, the device emitted a high-pitched sound that echoed through the clearing. The soldiers winced, covering their ears, but it wasn't just the sound, it was something else. The device emitted a signal, one that sent a ripple of energy through the air. Siri, who had been tense and ready to pounce, froze. She didn't move. Jack watched, his eyes wide, as the soldiers began to back away slowly, their weapons lowered. The woman's device had disabled their communication systems. For the first time, the soldiers were at a loss. They didn't know what to do. The leader of the soldiers looked around, confused and disoriented. What have you done?" he demanded. The woman didn't answer. She simply turned her back on them and walked toward Jack and Siri. They're not going to take her, she said firmly. Not while I'm here. Jack stood there still in shock as the soldiers turned and began to retreat, clearly outmatched. The leader's last words were barely audible. "This isn't over," he muttered. Jack didn't know what to say. He was still processing everything that had just happened. But one thing was clear, they were safe, for now. The woman stopped in front of Jack, looking at him with a mixture of curiosity and understanding. "I've been watching you," she said, her voice quieter now. "I've seen what you've done for her. You're not like the others." Jack didn't know how to respond. He was still trying to catch his breath, still reeling from the sudden turn of events. Siri, sensing that the immediate threat was over, relaxed slightly, though she still watched the soldiers with a wary eye. "Who are you?" Jack finally asked, his voice hoarse. The woman smiled, a small, knowing smile. "Someone who knows that not everything is as it seems, and someone who believes in protecting the things that matter." Jack nodded slowly, still trying to process everything. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't shown up." The woman shrugged. "You were already doing what needed to be done, but you're not alone anymore." Jack looked at her, feeling a sense of relief he hadn't felt in days. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone in this fight after all. And with Siri by his side and this new ally, he felt like he could take on whatever the galaxy threw at him.